December 4th, 1991, a cold, gray Wednesday in New York City. In a skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan, a phone rings. It is a call that had been dreaded for a decade, a call that marked the end of an era. The voice on the other end was brief. Shut it down. Within hours, the telex machines began to chatter across the globe, sending a final death sentence to offices in London, Tokyo, Rio de Janeiro, and Berlin. Pilots sitting in cockpits ready to push back from the gate were told to kill the engines. Flight attendants dressed in their pristine blue uniforms broke down in tears in the aisles. In Barbados, a crew was told to leave their aircraft on the tarmac and find their own way home. The money was gone. The fuel was gone. The dream was over. On that day, the most recognizable logo in the history of aviation, the blue globe of Pan American World Airways, ceased to mean freedom. It suddenly meant ruin. For over 60 years, Pan Am was not just an airline. It was the unofficial flag carrier of the United States. It was the chosen instrument of American power. It was the company that taught the world how to fly. They were the ones who conquered the Pacific Ocean with flying boats. They were the ones who ushered in the jet age. They were the ones who brought the Beatles to America. If you saw a movie in the 1960s, James Bond didn't fly United or Delta. He flew Pan Am. To step onto a Pan Am Clipper was to step onto American soil, no matter where you were in the world. It was a symbol of luxury, technological dominance, and cultural supremacy. And yet, it vanished. The airline that invented mass air travel, the company that practically owned the skies, collapsed into a pile of debt, terrorism, and corporate hubris. Today, the brand exists only on t-shirts and in nostalgia-soaked TV shows. The terminals are demolished or rebranded. The blue globe is a ghost. How does a titan, an entity that seemed as permanent as the Statue of Liberty, fall so hard and so fast? Was it really just bad luck? Or was the seed of its destruction planted the very moment it was born? To understand the death of the Queen of the Skies, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to meet the man who built the throne, a man who was equal parts visionary and tyrant, a man who believed the sky didn't belong to God, but to him. But before we take off into this turbulence, I have a small request. We are pouring thousands of hours of research and editing into this channel to bring you the true stories of fallen empires. We are fighting hard to monetize this project so we can keep the lights on and the quality high. If you value this kind of deep dive documentary content, please take 2 seconds, literally 2 seconds, to hit that subscribe button. It costs you nothing, but for us, it is the fuel that keeps this engine running. Thank you for being part of the crew. Now let's fly. The story of Pan Am is, at its core, the story of Juan Trippe. Born in 1899 into a wealthy banking family, Trippe wasn't your typical scrappy entrepreneur. He was American royalty. He was educated at Yale. He walked with the confidence of a man who had never heard the word no. He was quiet, calculating, and intensely private. He didn't have the flamboyant charisma of a showman. He had the cold, chess master gaze of an emperor. While at Yale, Trippe fell in love with aviation. But unlike the barnstormers and stunt pilots of the 1920s who saw planes as thrilling toys, Trippe saw them as something else. He saw them as merchant ships. He looked at the sky and saw shipping lanes. He realized that the future of commerce wasn't on the sea or the rails, but in the air. In 1927, aviation was a chaotic, dangerous mess. Airlines were popping up and crashing down every week. It was the Wild West. But Trippe had a plan. He wasn't interested in flying mail between obscure American towns. He wanted the world. He formed a small company called Pan American Airways. His assets were meager: a few small planes and a whole lot of ambition. His target? The 90-mile stretch of water between Key West, Florida, and Havana, Cuba. This wasn't a random choice. Havana was the playground of the Americas, a city of casinos, rum, and wealth, especially during the dry years of Prohibition in the U.S. Rich Americans wanted to get there fast, and they wanted to drink. Trippe secured a contract to carry U.S. mail to Cuba. But there was a problem. He didn't have a runway in Havana. In a move that would define his business style for the next 40 years, Trippe flew to Cuba and managed to secure landing rights on a dusty strip of land called Camp Columbia. But he didn't just get permission. He engineered a monopoly. When a rival airline tried to beat him to the punch, they arrived in Havana only to find that the only landing strip available was controlled by Juan Trippe. He had locked them out. The rival company had no choice but to sell out to Pan Am. This was the Trippe playbook. Strike first, secure exclusive rights, and choke the competition before they can even take a breath. On October 19, 1927, a small Fokker F-7 aircraft took off from Key West and landed in Havana. It was the first scheduled international flight by an American airline. It carried mail, not passengers. But within months, Trippe was flying wealthy tourists to the Cuban sunshine. The service was impeccable. The pilots were treated like naval officers wearing crisp uniforms that signaled authority and safety. Trippe knew that to get people into these fragile wooden and metal tubes, he had to sell confidence. He banned the word pilot and used captain. He banned flight crew and used officers. He wasn't running an airline. He was running a merchant navy of the clouds. But Key West to Havana was just the appetizer. Trippe looked at the map and saw the Caribbean not as a collection of islands, but as stepping stones. He began to expand aggressively. He hired Charles Lindbergh, the most famous man on the planet after his solo crossing of the Atlantic, as a technical advisor. Having Lindbergh on the payroll was a masterstroke of PR. It gave Pan Am instant legitimacy. With Lindbergh scouting the routes, Pan Am began to hop from island to island: Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, Haiti. Wherever Pan Am went, they built infrastructure. They built radio stations, weather bureaus, and docks. They weren't just an airline. In many of these places, they were the only link to the outside world. Trippe's ambition, however, ran into a political wall. To fly internationally, you needed the permission of foreign governments. Normally, this is a job for the State Department, but Juan Trippe didn't trust diplomats. He created his own foreign ministry within Pan Am. He had foreign ministers who negotiated directly with presidents and dictators across Latin America. They offered deals, bribes, and promises of economic development. Pan Am was operating like a sovereign nation. By the early 1930s, Pan Am had encircled South America. They were flying down the coasts of Brazil and Argentina, crossing the Andes. They were the undisputed masters of the Southern Hemisphere. But Trippe was bored with the South. He wanted the oceans. Crossing the Atlantic or the Pacific in the 1930s was considered scientifically impossible for a commercial payload. The distances were too vast, the engines too unreliable, the fuel consumption too high. But Trippe didn't care about physics. He cared about contracts. He went to the aircraft manufacturers, Sikorsky, Martin, Boeing, and issued a challenge. He wanted a flying boat, a plane that could land on water since there were no runways in the middle of the ocean, and carry enough fuel and passengers to make money. The engineers told him he was crazy. They said a plane that big wouldn't get off the water. Trippe simply slammed his hand on the table and said, "Build it." And they did. The result was the Sikorsky S-40 and later the legendary Martin M-130, known as the China Clipper. The inauguration of the Pacific route in 1935 is one of the most romantic moments in industrial history. Picture the scene: San Francisco Bay, hundreds of thousands of people lining the shores, the massive silver flying boat sitting in the water, the captain radioing the base, "Pan American Clipper destined for Manila, ready." The engines roaring to life, churning the water into white foam. The beast lifting slowly, heavily, into the air, passing under the unfinished Golden Gate Bridge, heading west into the void. It was a moonshot. The route required stops at tiny specks of land in the vast Pacific: Honolulu, Midway, Wake Island, Guam, Manila. Wake Island was uninhabited. It was a desolate coral atoll. Pan Am had to ship everything there: food, water, fuel, hotel staff, furniture, even the soil to grow flowers for the hotel guests. They literally built civilization on a rock just to refuel their planes. This was the golden age of the flying boats. Travel was slow, but it was magnificent. Passengers sat in wicker chairs and ate five-course meals served on fine china. They slept in real beds. The flight from San Francisco to Manila took 6 days, hopping from island to island. It cost the equivalent of $15,000 in today's money. It was exclusive, it was adventurous, and it was all Pan Am. By the late 1930s, Pan Am was the only airline in the world flying regularly across the Pacific. And soon they conquered the Atlantic too, flying the mighty Boeing 314 Yankee Clipper to Lisbon and Southampton. Juan Trippe had achieved the impossible. He had linked the continents, but as Pan Am's silver wings spanned the globe, the world below was darkening. War was coming. And Pan Am, with its global network of radio stations, island bases, and long-range aircraft, was about to become much more than a luxury travel company. It was about to become a weapon. When World War II broke out, the U.S. military realized that Pan Am was the only entity that knew how to fly across oceans reliably. The Army and Navy didn't have the maps, the weather data, or the pilots with long-range experience. Juan Trippe did. Overnight, the chosen instrument became vital to national survival. Pan Am flew secret missions for the government. They ferried generals and presidents. Franklin D. Roosevelt flew on a Pan Am Clipper to the Casablanca Conference to meet Churchill. They transported uranium for the Manhattan Project. They built airfields in the jungles of Brazil and the deserts of Africa to supply the Allied forces. Trippe used the war to cement his dominance. He negotiated hard with the government, ensuring that Pan Am would emerge from the conflict stronger than ever. He believed that after the war, the United States would reward him with a legal monopoly on all international travel. He envisioned Pan Am as a community airline, the single U.S. flag carrier, subsidized and protected by the government, just like British Airways or Air France. But Trippe made a fatal miscalculation. He underestimated the jealousy of his rivals and the suspicion of Washington. While he was busy conquering the world, enemies were sharpening their knives back home. The end of World War II in 1945 marked a pivot point. The flying boats were obsolete. Concrete runways had been built all over the world for bombers. The age of land planes had arrived. And a new competitor was emerging, not from the airline industry, but from the political swamp. Domestic airlines like TWA, American, and United looked at Pan Am's global empire with envy. They wanted a piece of the international pie. They lobbied Congress, arguing that a Pan Am monopoly was un-American. Why should Juan Trippe own the world? They asked. Trippe fought back with arrogance. He believed he was untouchable. But in a stunning defeat, the U.S. government decided against the community airline concept. They opened up international routes to competition. Suddenly, TWA was flying to Paris. Northwest was flying to Tokyo. Pan Am's exclusive grip on the globe was broken. But Juan Trippe wasn't done. If he couldn't have a legal monopoly, he would have a technological one. He decided to do something that would render his competitors obsolete overnight. He decided to invent the future again. The year was 1955. The world was flying on propeller planes, the DC-6, the Constellation. They were loud, they vibrated, and they took 12 hours to cross the Atlantic. The British had tried to build a jetliner, the Comet, but it had tragically disintegrated in mid-air due to metal fatigue. The industry was terrified of jets. They were seen as dangerous and too thirsty for fuel. Trippe ignored the fear. He went to Boeing. At the time, Boeing was primarily a military bomber manufacturer. They had a prototype for a jet tanker, the Dash 80. Trippe looked at it and said, "Turn it into an airliner." He didn't just order a few. In a single day, in a move that shocked Wall Street, Trippe ordered 20 Boeing 707s and 25 Douglas DC-8s. It was a massive financial gamble. He was betting the entire company on jet propulsion. When the Pan Am Boeing 707 launched in 1958, it was like a spaceship had landed. It flew twice as high as propeller planes, above the weather. It was smooth, it was quiet, and most importantly, it was fast. It cut the flight time from New York to London from 12 hours to 6. Pan Am had shrunk the world by half. The jet set was born. And Pan Am was its clubhouse. The blue globe was everywhere. It was the peak of American soft power. If you were a celebrity, a politician, or a spy, you were in the first-class lounge of a Pan Am 707. The service was legendary. They served maxims of Paris cuisine at 30,000 feet. The stewardesses, and they were strictly called stewardesses then, were recruited for their beauty, poise, and language skills. To work for Pan Am was more prestigious than winning a beauty pageant. It was a career that offered the world. But for Juan Trippe, the 707 wasn't enough. It was too small. He saw the airports getting crowded. He saw the demand for travel exploding. He wanted to bring the cost of flying down so that not just the rich, but the average American could see Europe. He needed a bus, a really, really big bus. In the mid-1960s, Trippe went back to Boeing. He famously took the head of Boeing, Bill Allen, on a fishing trip. While they were on the boat, Trippe laid out his vision. He wanted a plane 2.5 times the size of the 707, a wide body, a double-decker, a flying ocean liner. Bill Allen thought it was insane. The engineering challenges were immense. The engines didn't exist yet. The factories weren't big enough to build it. But Trippe used his ultimate leverage. He said, "If you build it, I'll buy it." Allen replied, "If you buy it, I'll build it." That handshake launched the Boeing 747, the jumbo jet. It is impossible to overstate the risk here. Pan Am ordered 25 of them for $500 million, the largest corporate purchase in history at that time. Boeing had to mortgage the company to build the factory. Pan Am had to mortgage the company to buy the planes. It was a suicide pact. If the 747 failed, both Boeing and Pan Am would die. But Trippe was obsessed with the idea of mass travel. He believed the 747 would be a weapon for peace. He thought that if regular people could travel freely to other countries, wars would become impossible. It was a noble, naive, and incredibly expensive dream. The development of the 747 was a nightmare. The engines, massive high-bypass turbofans from Pratt & Whitney, kept failing. The weight of the plane grew, the delivery dates slipped. But finally, in January 1970, the first Pan Am 747, the Clipper Young America, stood on the tarmac at JFK. It was magnificent. It had a spiral staircase. It had a piano bar in the upper deck. It was the size of an apartment building. When it landed in London, people gasped. It was the pinnacle of Pan Am's arrogance and achievement. They had redefined gravity. But timing is everything in business, and Juan Trippe's timing, usually perfect, was about to be catastrophically wrong. The 747 was designed for a booming economy and cheap oil, but just as Pan Am began taking delivery of these massive, fuel-guzzling giants, the world changed. The 1970s were waiting around the corner with a baseball bat. Trippe retired in 1968, leaving the cockpit just before the storm hit. He left behind a fleet of massive planes that were hard to fill, a corporate culture that was used to spending money like water, and a route network that had a fatal, invisible flaw. You see, Pan Am had a secret weakness, a poison pill buried in its founding charter. They were America's international airline. They had permission to fly from New York to London or San Francisco to Tokyo, but they were forbidden by U.S. law from flying within the United States. If you lived in St. Louis and wanted to fly Pan Am to Paris, you first had to buy a ticket on TWA or United to get to New York, switch terminals, and then get on Pan Am. For decades, this didn't matter because Pan Am was so superior. But as domestic airlines got jets and started flying internationally too, it became a death sentence. United Airlines could fly you from St. Louis to New York and then keep you on the same plane to London. Pan Am had no feeder network. They had no domestic passengers to fill those massive 747s. They were a giant with no legs, floating in the ocean, unable to come ashore. And then, in 1973, the geopolitical floor fell out. The OPEC oil embargo. Almost overnight, the price of jet fuel quadrupled. The 747, which was designed when fuel cost pennies, suddenly became a financial black hole. Flying a half-empty jumbo jet across the Atlantic wasn't just unprofitable, it was burning cash at a rate that no company could sustain. The economy entered a recession. People stopped traveling. The golden age hit a brick wall. For the first time in its history, Pan Am began to bleed. The losses were in the millions, then hundreds of millions. The executives who had been raised in the culture of Trippe always wins didn't know how to shrink. They didn't know how to cut costs. They kept flying empty 747s to exotic destinations because that's what Pan Am did. They were the masters of the universe, and masters don't retreat. But the universe doesn't care about prestige, it cares about math, and the math was turning red. The slow, agonizing descent of Icarus had begun, and waiting in the shadows were the predators, the deregulators, the terrorists, and the sheer weight of their own history. The decline wasn't immediate. It was a long, painful slide from grace that would strip the airline of its assets, its dignity, and finally, its life. Juan Trippe's gamble with the Boeing 747 was not just an order for a new plane. It was an order for a new world. To accommodate these giants, he didn't just need new runways. He needed a new home. In 1960, Pan Am had already opened the World Port at JFK Airport in New York. It was a terminal shaped like a flying saucer, a modernist cathedral of glass and steel. It was designed to allow planes to park right under the roof, protecting passengers from the rain as they walked to the jetway. It was sleek, futuristic, and quintessentially Pan Am. But the 747 was too big for the World Port. So Pan Am spent millions expanding it, reinforcing the concrete, raising the roofs. They built a terminal fit for an emperor. Inside, there were no chaotic lines. There were clipper clubs, lounges that felt more like the lobby of the Ritz-Carlton than an airport waiting room. Deep leather armchairs, heavy crystal ashtrays, free-flowing champagne. The staff knew the frequent flyers by name. If you were a Pan Am passenger, you weren't just a ticket number. You were a citizen of the world. However, outside the glass walls of the World Port, the economic storm was gathering force. By 1974, the oil crisis had fully set in. The price of jet fuel had quadrupled. The Boeing 747s, which Pan Am had bought to democratize travel, were flying across the Atlantic with hundreds of empty seats. Each flight was hemorrhaging money. The break-even load factor, the percentage of seats you need to sell just to cover costs, had jumped from 50% to nearly 70%. Pan Am was barely hitting 40%. And then came the regulatory nightmare. For decades, Juan Trippe had used his political connections to keep competitors at bay. But Trippe was gone, and the mood in Washington had shifted. The Civil Aeronautics Board, CAB, the government agency that controlled routes and fares, began to favor deregulation. They believed that competition would lower prices for consumers. They were right. But for Pan Am, it was a disaster. The government started handing out international routes like candy. Suddenly, airlines like Braniff, Delta, and Eastern were allowed to fly to London, Paris, and Tokyo. These domestic airlines had a massive advantage. They could feed passengers from all over the U.S. into their international hubs. A passenger could fly Delta from Atlanta to New York and then jump on a Delta flight to London without changing terminals or checking bags twice. Pan Am, still legally forbidden from flying domestic routes, was starving. Their planes were taking off from New York, half empty because they had no way to get passengers from Chicago, Dallas, or Denver to their gateway. They were an island in a rising sea of competition. Desperate to fix this fatal flaw, Pan Am's management made a decision that many business historians consider one of the worst mergers of all time. In 1980, under the leadership of William Sewell, Pan Am bought National Airlines. On paper, it made sense. National was a domestic carrier with a strong network in Florida and the East Coast. It would give Pan Am the feeder traffic it desperately needed. But the execution was a catastrophe. Pan Am paid $400 million for National, a massive overpayment. A bidding war had driven the price up, and Pan Am, desperate and arrogant, refused to back down. They drained their cash reserves to buy a company that, frankly, didn't want to be bought. The merger was a cultural war. Pan Am was old money, elitist, global, and formal. National was scrappy, domestic, and informal. The employees hated each other. The pilots' unions fought bitterly over seniority lists. The computer systems were incompatible. Instead of creating a seamless network, the merger created chaos. Expenses skyrocketed. The expected synergies never materialized. And while Pan Am was distracted fighting its own internal civil war, the world changed again. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter signed the Airline Deregulation Act. The government stopped setting ticket prices. Airlines could now charge whatever they wanted. A brutal price war erupted. New low-cost carriers popped up, offering bare-bones service for rock-bottom prices. Pan Am, with its high union wages, its massive overhead, and its obsession with luxury, couldn't compete on price. They were selling champagne in a world that suddenly just wanted a cheap seat and a bag of peanuts. To stay afloat, Pan Am began to sell the family silver. First, they sold their iconic headquarters, the Pan Am building in Midtown Manhattan, now the MetLife building, for $400 million. It was a humiliating blow. The building that literally had their name carved in stone, a symbol of their dominance over the New York skyline, was gone. Then, they sold their chain of luxury hotels, Intercontinental. Juan Trippe had built this chain so his passengers would always have a safe, American standard place to sleep, from Kabul to Kinshasa. It was a profitable jewel in the crown. Sold. But the most painful sale came in 1985. Desperate for cash, Pan Am sold its entire Pacific division to United Airlines for $750 million. Think about that for a second. The Pacific Division, the routes that Juan Trippe had pioneered with the China Clipper, the ocean that Pan Am had conquered before anyone else, the very soul of the airline's adventurous spirit. They sold it to a domestic competitor just to make payroll. Overnight, Pan Am ceased to be a global airline. They were now just an Atlantic carrier with a broken domestic network. The airline was shrinking, bleeding, and stumbling, but it still had one thing left: its reputation. Despite the financial rot, the brand still carried a certain mystique. To the average person, Pan Am was still the flag carrier. It was still the symbol of America abroad. And that symbolism would become its final curse. Because Pan Am wasn't just a target for competitors, it was a target for America's enemies. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, Pan Am aircraft were frequent targets of hijackings and terror attacks. The blue globe on the tail was a proxy for the stars and stripes. If you wanted to hurt America, you hurt Pan Am. In 1973, terrorists attacked a Pan Am flight in Rome, killing 30 people. In 1982, a bomb exploded on a Pan Am flight from Tokyo to Honolulu, killing a teenager. In 1986, terrorists hijacked Pan Am Flight 73 in Karachi, Pakistan. The brave flight attendant saved hundreds of lives, but 20 people died in the gunfire. Each attack chipped away at the public's confidence. Pan Am tried to reassure passengers. They launched a massive security program called Alert. They claimed to have the tightest security in the industry. They surcharged tickets to pay for extra guards and X-ray machines. They told the world, "We are safe." But terrorists only need to get lucky once. December 21st, 1988. Pan Am Flight 103. It was a Boeing 747 named Clipper Maid of the Seas. It took off from London Heathrow, bound for New York, carrying 243 passengers and 16 crew. It was just 4 days before Christmas. The plane was packed with families going home for the holidays, students returning from study abroad programs, and soldiers on leave. The mood on board was festive. Champagne was being poured in first class. 38 minutes after takeoff, as the plane was cruising at 31,000 feet over the small Scottish town of Lockerbie, a bomb hidden inside a Toshiba cassette player in the forward cargo hold detonated. The explosion punched a 20-inch hole in the fuselage, but at that altitude and speed, the structural integrity of the aircraft failed instantly. The nose of the 747, including the cockpit, snapped off. The rest of the fuselage continued forward for a few seconds before disintegrating. 259 people on the plane died instantly or within moments. But the horror wasn't confined to the sky. The wings, still full of jet fuel, plummeted to Earth like a massive incendiary bomb. They slammed into Sherwood Crescent in Lockerbie, creating a crater 47 meters long and destroying several houses. 11 people on the ground were vaporized. The total death toll was 270. Lockerbie wasn't just a tragedy, it was the final nail in Pan Am's coffin. The aftermath was a PR and legal nightmare. Investigations revealed that Pan Am's security, the security they had boasted about, was full of holes. The bomb had been loaded onto a feeder flight in Frankfurt and transferred to the Pan Am flight in London without the passenger accompanying the bag ever boarding. It was a violation of basic security protocols. The FAA fined Pan Am $630,000 for 19 security failures. But the real cost was trust. The public looked at Pan Am and no longer saw luxury or adventure. They saw a flying target. They saw death. Passenger traffic collapsed. Nobody wanted to fly the terrorist airline. Empty planes flew back and forth across the Atlantic, burning fuel Pan Am couldn't afford. The $300 million lawsuit from the families of the victims loomed over the company like a dark cloud. The executives in the Pan Am building, which they were now just renting, tried everything to save the ship. They appointed a new CEO, Thomas Plaskett. He was a smart, capable airline veteran. He tried to modernize the fleet. He tried to merge with other airlines. But the brand was toxic. The debt was too high. The hole was too deep. Then came August 1990. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. The Gulf War began. Oil prices spiked again. International travel plummeted due to fear of war and terrorism. It was the exact same scenario as 1973, but this time, Pan Am had no reserves left, no buildings to sell, no hotels to liquidate, no Pacific Division to auction off. On January 8, 1991, Pan Am filed for bankruptcy protection. It wasn't an immediate death. The airline kept flying for almost a year, sustained by a drip feed of cash from Delta Airlines. Delta wanted Pan Am's remaining assets, the European routes, the shuttle service, and the terminal at JFK. They promised to fund a new Pan Am, a smaller airline that would focus on Latin America. For months, the employees held on to hope. They wore buttons that said, "Don't let the dream die." They took pay cuts. They believed that Pan Am was too important, too historic, too American to fail. But Delta looked at the books. They saw the losses mounting every day. They saw the endless legal liabilities from Lockerbie. And on December 3, 1991, Delta's executives decided to pull the plug. They stopped the funding. The call came the next morning. December 4th, 1991. Shut it down. There was no orderly wind down, no final farewell tour. It was a sudden cardiac arrest. Planes were grounded wherever they happened to be. Thousands of passengers were stranded. 7,500 employees lost their jobs instantly. In Miami, the headquarters of the Latin American division, grown men wept openly in the corridors. Pilots who had flown presidents and weathered typhoons sat in the crew lounges, staring at the floor, unable to speak. The blue ball, the logo that had stood for excellence for 64 years, was covered up with tarps. The liquidation was brutal. The iconic Worldport terminal was sold to Delta. The routes were carved up between United and American. The name Pan Am was sold to a bankruptcy trustee who later licensed it to a small railroad company and a couple of failed airline startups that had nothing to do with the original. Juan Trippe, who had died in 1981, didn't live to see the end. He was spared the sight of his empire being auctioned off for scraps. But as the dust settled on the runway, a question remained. A question that haunts every business school case study about Pan Am to this day. Was it inevitable? Could Pan Am have survived? Some say yes, if they had bought a domestic airline sooner, if they hadn't bought National, if they had been humbler, if Lockerbie hadn't happened. But perhaps the truth is darker. Perhaps Pan Am was built for a world that no longer existed. It was built for an era of regulated monopolies, of close ties between government and industry, of travel as an elite privilege. When the world became democratic, chaotic, and competitive, the imperial airline couldn't adapt. It was a dinosaur in the age of mammals. And yet, Pan Am left something behind that cannot be liquidated. It left a standard. It created the modern airport. It created the economy class that allows you to visit your family overseas. It created the global hotel chain. It created the air traffic control procedures we use today. Every time you step onto a plane, turn left or right, and fly across an ocean, you are living in the world Juan Trippe built. But the story doesn't end with the bankruptcy filing. Because when an empire this big dies, the shockwaves are felt for decades. In the next part, we are going to explore the ghost of Pan Am. We will look at what happened to the legendary Worldport terminal, the tragic fate of the employees who lost their pensions, and the strange cult-like nostalgia that keeps the brand alive today. And we will answer the final question. In a world of budget airlines and cramped seats, have we lost something we can never get back? Stay tuned. The flight isn't over yet. The morning of December 5th, 1991, dawned over Kennedy Airport in New York. But for the first time in 64 years, the sun did not shine on Pan Am. The counters were dark. The terminals were silent. The giant Boeing 747s, once the queens of the sky, sat parked on the tarmac like beached whales, their engines covered in canvas, their tires chalked. They were no longer clippers. They were just assets in a bankruptcy liquidation, waiting to be repossessed by creditors, repainted, and stripped of their identity. The shutdown was not just a business failure. It was a humanitarian crisis for the employees. Thousands of Pan Am staff found themselves stranded around the world. Pilots in Rio, flight attendants in London, mechanics in Frankfurt, they were cut loose without a return ticket. They had to beg other airlines for compassionate travel just to get home. The airline that had pioneered global connectivity couldn't even bring its own people back to American soil. In the weeks that followed, the vultures descended. The liquidation of Pan Am was a chaotic, undignified feeding frenzy. The remaining profitable routes were carved up by United, American, and Delta. The slots at Heathrow and Narita, priceless real estate in the aviation world, were sold off to the highest bidder. But the most painful spectacle was the auction of the brand itself. What is a name worth? What is the value of a logo that once stood for the United States itself? In 1993, a bankruptcy court auctioned off the Pan Am name, the Blue Globe logo, and the intellectual property. It was bought by an investment group for just $1.3 million. A brand that had generated billions in revenue. A brand that was more recognizable than Coca-Cola in the 1960s, was sold for the price of a modest house in the Hamptons. The new owners tried to resurrect the airline. They launched a new Pan Am in 1996. They painted an Airbus A300 in the classic livery. They hired some of the old flight attendants. They tried to tap into the nostalgia, but it was a zombie. It had the skin of Pan Am, but it had no soul, no network, and no Juan Trippe. It was a budget carrier trying to wear a tuxedo. It failed within 2 years. Then came Pan Am 3, a small outfit out of New Hampshire. Then Pan Am 4. The logo was passed around like a cheap commodity. Eventually, in a twist of irony that would have made Juan Trippe spin in his grave, the famous Blue Globe ended up plastered on the side of rusting boxcars. A company called Guilford Transportation Industries bought the brand and renamed itself Pan Am Railways. The logo that had conquered the stratosphere was now chugging along old freight tracks in rural Maine, covered in graffiti and coal dust. The chosen instrument of the skies had become a cargo train. It was the ultimate degradation of a corporate icon. But if the fate of the brand was tragic, the fate of the physical empire was heartbreaking. To understand the scale of the loss, we have to look at the two cathedrals Pan Am built in New York City, the Pan Am Building and the World Port. The Pan Am Building at 200 Park Avenue was the ultimate symbol of the airline's power in the 1960s. Sitting directly on top of Grand Central Terminal, it was a brutalist monolith that blocked the view down Park Avenue. New Yorkers hated it, but Juan Trippe loved it. It was massive, imposing, and inescapable. It had the largest corporate logo in the world painted on its facade, Pan Am, in 15-foot-tall letters. But the building carried a curse. It was the site of one of the most gruesome accidents in New York history, an event that many say marked the beginning of the airline's spiritual decline. In the 1960s and 70s, Pan Am operated a helicopter service. You could fly from JFK Airport to the roof of the Pan Am Building in Manhattan in 7 minutes. It was the height of convenience for the jet set. You landed on top of the skyscraper, took an elevator down to the Clipper Club, had a martini, and stepped out onto 42nd Street. On May 16, 1977, a New York Airways helicopter landed on the roof. It was idling, waiting to pick up passengers. Suddenly, the landing gear collapsed. The helicopter tipped over. The main rotor blades, spinning at full speed, smashed into the roof surface and shattered. A 20-foot blade detached and spun across the helipad like a giant scythe. It slashed through the line of waiting passengers. 5 people were killed instantly, decapitated or severed by the blade. The horror didn't stop there. Part of the broken rotor blade flew over the edge of the roof and plummeted 59 stories down to the street below. It crashed onto Madison Avenue, killing a woman walking on the sidewalk. The accident was a PR disaster. It ended the helicopter service forever. But symbolically, it was potent. The sky gods had fallen to earth. The blood on the roof of the Pan Am Building seemed to foreshadow the carnage that Lockerbie would bring a decade later. When Pan Am sold the building to MetLife in 1981 to cover its debts, the removal of the giant Pan Am letters was a public castration. The King of New York was evicted from his own castle. Then there was the World Port, Terminal 3 at JFK, the Flying Saucer. When it opened in 1960, it was the most futuristic building in America. Its cantilevered roof hung over the jets like a protective umbrella. It was designed for the small Boeing 707s. But when the 747s arrived, The terminal couldn't handle them. The giant tails of the jumbos stuck out, exposed to the snow and rain. After Pan Am's collapse, Delta Airlines took over the world port. But they didn't treat it as a historic monument, they treated it as a burden. The terminal was falling apart. The roof leaked. The iconic zodiac sculptures in the ceiling gathered dust. The futuristic glass walls were covered in grime. For 20 years, the world port rotted in plain sight. It became a symbol of the decay of American infrastructure. Preservationists fought to save it. They argued that the world port was to the jet age what Grand Central is to the railway age. It was a masterpiece of mid-century architecture. They started petitions. They lobbied the government. Save the World Port became a rallying cry for aviation geeks and historians. Delta didn't care. They wanted a new terminal. They wanted efficiency. In 2013, the bulldozers arrived. There was no implosion, just a slow, grinding tearing down of steel and concrete. The flying saucer was ripped apart by excavators. The roof that had sheltered millions of passengers embarking on the great adventures of their lives was turned into scrap metal. And what replaced this architectural marvel? What stands today on the site of the world port? A parking lot for airplanes. That's it. Concrete pavement. There is no plaque. No statue of Juan Trippe. No marker saying, "Here stood the gateway to the world." It's just asphalt where Delta parks its overflow jets. The erasure was complete. This is the cruelty of American capitalism. It has no memory. If it doesn't make money today, it is destroyed. Pan Am built the infrastructure of the modern world, and the modern world paved over it without a second thought. But the ruins of Pan Am are not just physical. They are financial, and they are deeply personal. We need to talk about the Pan Am family. Juan Trippe didn't just run a company, he ran a cult. Employees were fiercely loyal. They called themselves Pan Amers. There was a belief, drilled into them from training day, that they were elite. They were the best pilots, the most sophisticated stewardesses, the most skilled mechanics. They were the chosen ones. This loyalty was weaponized against them. During the slow decline of the 1980s, management repeatedly asked the employees for help. "Take a pay cut," they said. "Give back your vacation days. Freeze your pensions. We need to save the airline." And the employees did, again and again. They sacrificed their own financial security to keep the blue ball flying. They believed that if they worked hard enough, the glory days would return. They were wrong. When the bankruptcy hit, the pension fund was revealed to be catastrophically underfunded. Pan Am had been using the pension money to pay operating expenses. It was legal, but it was lethal. When the airline liquidated, the pension plan was taken over by the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, PBGC, a federal agency. But the PBGC has caps. It doesn't pay out the full amount, especially for pilots and high earners. Overnight captains who had flown 747s for 30 years saw their retirement income slashed by 50%, 60%, sometimes 70%. Stewardesses who had lived the glamorous life in the 60s, traveling to Paris and Tokyo, found themselves in their 50s with no job, no health insurance, and a pension that barely covered rent. Many of them had to go back to work as greeters at Walmart or clerks at grocery stores. The queens of the sky were bagging groceries. The human cost was devastating. Suicides, divorces, alcoholism. The Pan Am family was left orphaned. But the most bitter pill was the Lockerbie settlement. Remember the lawsuit against Libya for the bombing of Flight 103? It dragged on for years. Finally, in 2003, Muammar Gaddafi admitted responsibility and agreed to pay $2.7 billion in compensation. It was a massive victory for justice. But for Pan Am, it was a cosmic joke. The settlement money went to the families of the victims, which was right and just. But a portion of it was supposed to go to the airline itself, to compensate for the loss of the aircraft and the destruction of the business. But by 2003, Pan Am had been dead for 12 years. The airline that received the money was just a shell company run by bankruptcy lawyers. The millions of dollars that could have saved the airline in 1991 arrived a decade too late. It was devoured by legal fees and creditors. The employees, the people who had lost their careers, saw almost none of it. So we have the brand on a freight train. We have the terminal turned into a parking lot. We have the employees stripped of their pensions. Is there anything left? Is there any part of Pan Am that survived the crash? To find the answer, we have to look away from the tragedy and look at the legacy. Because while the company failed, the revolution succeeded. Pan Am changed the DNA of the human species. Before Pan Am, growing up in New York and visiting London was a fantasy. It was something only aristocrats did on steamships. Pan Am made it something a school teacher could do in the summer. They shrank the planet. They created the global village. The internet connects us digitally, but Pan Am connected us physically. And there is one specific place where the ghost of Pan Am is still alive, preserved in amber, waiting for us to visit. It's not an airport. It's not a museum. It's a strange, windowless warehouse in Pacoima, California, a place where time stopped in 1970. In the next part, we are going to step inside the Pan Am experience. We are going to meet the people who refuse to let the dream die. We will analyze the 7 deadly sins of the airline's management, the specific, forensic reasons why they failed, so you can avoid them in your own life. And we will ask the final question. In our race to make flying cheaper, have we destroyed the magic of flight forever? Pan Am is dead. Long live Pan Am. In a nondescript industrial park in Pacoima, California, sandwiched between auto body shops and warehouses, there is a time machine. From the outside, it looks like nothing. But step through the doors of Air Hollywood, and you are instantly transported back to 1971. This is the Pan Am experience. It is the brainchild of Anthony Toth, an aviation obsessive who spent decades and a small fortune collecting artifacts from the dead airline. He hunted down the exact seats from a Pan Am 747. He found the original china plates, the glassware, the silverware. He bought the actual wall panels from a scrapped fuselage in the Mojave Desert. He reassembled a perfect 1-to-1 scale replica of a Pan Am 747 first-class cabin, specifically the Clipper class of the early 70s, and people flocked to it. Every weekend, people pay hundreds of dollars not to go anywhere, but to sit in these seats for 4 hours. They dress up in vintage suits and evening gowns, actors playing flight attendants, wearing authentic vintage uniforms. Serve them a 5-course meal, carved roast beef, caviar, free-flowing champagne. There is no Wi-Fi, no seatback screens, just the smell of expensive perfume, the clink of crystal, and the illusion that the world is still glamorous. Why do they do it? Why do people spend money to pretend to fly on a bankrupt airline? Because Pan Am wasn't just selling transportation. They were selling dignity. The Pan Am experience proves that the brand has transcended business to become a cultural aesthetic. You see it in the hit TV show Pan Am that aired in 2011, starring Margot Robbie. You see it in the high-fashion bags that still sell for hundreds of dollars in boutiques in Tokyo and Paris. The blue logo has become a symbol of a lost optimism, a retro future where technology was going to save us, not enslave us. But nostalgia is a dangerous drug. It blurs the edges of reality. It makes us forget the smoke-filled cabins, the racism, the sexism, and the astronomical prices. A round-trip ticket from New York to London in 1960 cost the equivalent of $5,000 today. We cannot let the romance blind us to the cold, hard facts. Pan Am didn't die because of a lack of glamour. It died because of a series of catastrophic business decisions. It is time to put the patient on the table. We are going to perform the final autopsy. We have identified the 7 deadly sins that killed the Queen of the Skies. If you are an entrepreneur, a CEO, or just someone trying to understand how money works, pay attention. These are the mistakes that can destroy even the biggest empire. Sin number 1, the imperial mindset, hubris. Juan Trippe built Pan Am as a pseudo-government. He negotiated treaties. He ignored local laws. He treated competitors like peasants. This arrogance worked in the 1930s and 40s, when he had the only planes that could cross oceans. But when the world caught up, Pan Am didn't know how to compete. They didn't know how to hustle. They kept acting like royalty even after the revolution had stormed the palace. The executives in the Pan Am building were so insulated from reality that they continued to order fleets of 747s and build massive terminals while the balance sheet was bleeding red. They believed they were too big to fail, 40 years before that term became popular. They were wrong. Sin number 2, the missing domestic leg. This is the technical bullet that killed the beast. We mentioned it before, but it bears repeating. You cannot run a global airline without a domestic feeder network. Imagine if Amazon could only deliver packages between countries, but wasn't allowed to deliver them to your door. That was Pan Am. Every other major airline, United, American, Delta, British Airways, Lufthansa, had a strong home market to funnel passengers into their international flights. Pan Am had to fight for every single passenger at the gateway. They were relying on their competitors to fly people to New York or Los Angeles. When those competitors started flying internationally themselves, they simply stopped feeding Pan Am. The result? Pan Am was flying massive 747s across the Atlantic that were half empty, while TWA and British Airways were flying full. It was a structural disadvantage that no amount of good service could fix. Sin number 3, the 747 gamble, bad timing. Juan Trippe's decision to order 25 Boeing 747s in 1966 was visionary, yes, but it was also reckless. He bet the entire company on the assumption that air travel would grow at 15% per year forever. He didn't account for a downturn. When the oil crisis of 1973 hit, those 747s became anchors around the company's neck. They were too big to fill and too expensive to fly. Pan Am was stuck with a fleet of gas-guzzling giants right at the moment the world wanted fuel-efficient compacts. If Trippe had ordered smaller planes or fewer 747s, the airline might have weathered the storm. Instead, the debt from buying those planes crushed them for 20 years. Sin number 4, the merger from hell. The acquisition of National Airlines in 1980 was the right idea. Get domestic routes. Executed in the worst possible way. Pan Am overpaid wildly, $400 million. But worse, they failed to integrate the cultures. Pan Am was formal and rigid. National was casual and loose. The employees hated each other. The integration was so botched that costs actually went up after the merger. Instead of saving Pan Am, National Airlines became a dead weight that dragged them down faster. It is a textbook case study in how not to do M&A, mergers and acquisitions. Sin number 5, eating the seed corn. In business, you have assets that generate revenue, like routes and planes, and assets that generate prestige, like buildings. When you are in trouble, you sell the prestige to save the revenue. Pan Am did the opposite. They sold their most profitable division, the Pacific routes, to United Airlines in 1985. This was an act of insanity. The Pacific was the fastest growing market in the world. It was the future. By selling it, Pan Am got a quick injection of cash, $750 million, that kept the lights on for a few more years, but they guaranteed their long-term death. They cut off their own right arm to buy a sandwich. Once the Pacific was gone, Pan Am was no longer a global airline. It was a zombie walking. Sin number 6, the security theater. Pan Am marketed itself as the safest airline in the world. They charged a security surcharge on tickets. They claimed to screen every bag. But it was a lie. The investigation into Lockerbie revealed that Pan Am's security in Frankfurt and London was lax, underpaid, and poorly trained. The alert security program was mostly marketing. They were charging passengers for a service they weren't providing. When the bomb went off, the veil was lifted. The public realized that the world's most experienced airline was actually incompetent. The trust evaporated instantly. In the airline business, you can survive bad food, you can survive delays, but you cannot survive a reputation for being unsafe. Sin number 7, bad luck. We must be fair. Pan Am had terrible luck. The oil crisis of 1973, the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978, the Lockerbie bombing of 1988, the Gulf War of 1990. Any one of these events would have hurt a healthy airline. But hitting a weakened Pan Am one after another was fatal. It was like a boxer taking punches to the jaw in every round. Eventually, even the strongest fighter goes down. So the autopsy is complete. The cause of death was multiple organ failure induced by chronic arrogance and acute financial trauma. But knowing why it died doesn't explain why we miss it so much. If you walk through a modern airport today, LaGuardia, Heathrow, LAX, what do you see? You see people in sweatpants and flip-flops. You see security lines that look like prison intakes. You see plastic seats, overpriced fast food, and stress. The planes are crammed, the seats are shrinking, the service is practically non-existent. Flying has become a bus ride in the sky. It is a commodity. We buy the cheapest ticket on Expedia, and we expect to be miserable. Pan Am represents the opposite of that. It represents a time when the journey mattered as much as the destination. When you look at photos of a Pan Am cabin in the 1960s, you see something we have lost: space. People had legroom. They were eating real food with metal cutlery. They were talking to each other. The plane had a lounge where you could stand up and have a drink. It was civilized. We have traded that civilization for efficiency. We have traded the Clipper class for the basic economy. We have democratized the skies, which is a good thing. More people can fly today than Juan Trippe ever imagined. A flight from New York to London costs a fraction of what it did in 1950. That is progress. But in gaining the world, did we lose our soul? Pan Am sold a dream. The dream that America was benevolent, powerful, and stylish. That technology was elegant. That the future was going to be better than the past. When Pan Am died, that dream died with it. We woke up in a world of budget cuts, security theater, and race to the bottom capitalism. In the final part of this documentary, we are going to look at the very end. The gravesite of Juan Trippe. The scattered remnants of the fleet. And we will leave you with a final thought on what it means to build an empire that touches the stars, only to crash into the earth. We will also reveal the one airline today that is trying, and arguably failing, to replicate the Pan Am model. Is there a new Pan Am hidden in plain sight? Or is the era of the imperial airline gone forever? Don't unbuckle your seatbelt yet. The final descent is approaching. In a windowless warehouse in Pacoima, California, miles from the nearest airport, a group of people is boarding a flight that will never take off. They are dressed in vintage 1970s suits and evening gowns. They hand their boarding passes to a smiling agent wearing a pristine, super jet blue uniform. They step into the cabin of a Boeing 747, turn left and settle into plush red and blue seats. A flight attendant offers them a hot towel and a glass of champagne. The safety demonstration begins. The engines hum. This is the Pan Am experience. It is not a ride, it is a time machine. Created by aviation historian Anthony Toth, this is a perfect one-to-one scale replica of a Pan Am 747 first-class cabin from 1971. Every detail is obsessive. The china plates are real Pan Am porcelain. The silverware is real. The seats are the actual seats salvaged from the desert boneyards. The magazines in the seat pockets are original copies of Time and Life from 50 years ago. People pay hundreds of dollars to spend 4 hours sitting here, eating a 5-course meal of Chateaubriand and caviar, served by actors playing the role of Pan Am stewardesses. They pay to pretend. Why? Why would anyone spend a Saturday night inside a fake airplane fuselage in an industrial park? Because the Pan Am experience offers something that modern aviation has completely exterminated: dignity. When you sit in those wide seats, with plenty of legroom, being treated like a guest of honor rather than a security threat, you realize what we have lost. Pan Am didn't just sell transportation, it sold an event. Flying was an occasion. It was something you dressed up for. It was civilized. Today, flying is an ordeal. It is a bus ride in the sky. We are herded through security checkpoints, shouted at to remove our shoes, crammed into seats designed for children, and charged extra for a bag of pretzels. We are not passengers anymore. In the eyes of modern airline algorithms, we are self-loading freight. The success of the Pan Am experience proves that the ghost of the airline is still powerful. The brand has transcended bankruptcy to become a symbol of a lost optimism. It represents a retro future, a time when Americans believed that technology was going to make life more beautiful, not just faster and cheaper. But the legacy of Pan Am goes far beyond nostalgia and replica cabins. If you look closely, the DNA of Pan Am is still running the world. First, there is the concept of tourist class. Before Juan Trippe, flying was exclusively for the super rich. It was Trippe who fought the global cartels to lower ticket prices. He invented the rainbow class, economy. He believed that travel was a right, not a privilege. Every time you buy a cheap ticket to visit a friend in another country, you are using a system Juan Trippe fought to create. He democratized the sky. Second, the hotel industry. When Pan Am started flying to remote corners of the world in the 1940s, places like Belém, Brazil, or Karachi, Pakistan, there were no hotels that met American standards. So Trippe founded Intercontinental Hotels. He built luxury hotels in developing nations so his crew and passengers would have a safe place to sleep and clean water to drink. Today, Intercontinental is a massive global chain, but it started as a support system for an airline. Third, and most importantly, the technology. The Boeing 747, the jumbo jet that made mass tourism possible, would not exist without Pan Am. Trippe forced Boeing to build it. He pushed the engines to the limit. He bankrupted his own company to buy it. The 747 shrank the world. It allowed millions of people to cross oceans for the first time. It created the globalized economy we live in today. But there is a human legacy too, one that is both beautiful and tragic. We need to talk about the World Wings International. This is an organization of former Pan Am flight attendants. Decades after the airline vanished, they still meet, they still wear their wings, they raise money for charity, they support each other. I want you to think about that. How many ex-employees of a bankrupt company continue to meet 30 years later to celebrate the brand that fired them? Do you think former Enron employees have reunions? Do you think ex-Blockbuster clerks have a global society? No, but Pan Am was different. To work for Pan Am was to be part of a diplomatic corps. In the 1960s, Pan Am stewardesses were required to speak 2 languages, have a college degree, and pass rigorous etiquette training. They were the face of America abroad. When they walked through a terminal in Bangkok or Berlin, heads turned. They were celebrities. Even though the company betrayed them, stealing their pensions and leaving them with nothing, they remained fiercely loyal to the idea of Pan Am. They separate the management from the mission. The management was corrupt. the mission was noble. They truly believed they were bringing the world closer together. This cult of Pan Am reveals a deep truth about corporate culture. You can buy a company's assets, but you cannot buy its soul. Delta bought the Worldport, United bought the Pacific routes, but neither of them bought the loyalty. You can't buy the feeling of being a Pan-Amer. However, we must end this analysis with a cold dose of reality. We, the consumers, are also responsible for the death of Pan Am. We killed it. How? By voting with our wallets. Throughout the 1980s, when Pan Am was struggling, travelers had a choice. They could pay $800 to fly Pan Am with excellent service, or they could pay $400 to fly a budget carrier like People Express with zero service. Overwhelmingly, the public chose the $400 ticket. We claimed we wanted luxury, but what we really wanted was cheap travel. We demanded lower prices, and the market responded. To lower prices, airlines had to cut food, cut legroom, cut staff, and cut dignity. The race to the bottom was driven by consumer demand. Juan Trippe's dream was to make flying affordable for everyone. He succeeded, but in doing so, he destroyed the business model that made Pan Am special. You cannot have 5-course meals and $99 tickets at the same time. The math doesn't work. So Pan Am is a martyr. It died so that we could have Ryanair, Spirit, and Southwest. It died so that flying could become as common as taking a bus. In the final part of this documentary, we are going to visit the grave of the man himself, Juan Trippe. We will look at the shattered remains of the fleet. Where did the great clippers go to die? And we will deliver the final verdict on the American century. Was the fall of Pan Am the canary in the coal mine for the decline of American influence? As the sun sets on the runway, the ghost of the Clipper is cleared for one last takeoff. In a windowless warehouse in Pacoima, California, miles from the nearest airport, a group of people is boarding a flight that will never take off. They are dressed in vintage 1970s suits and evening gowns. They hand their boarding passes to a smiling agent wearing a pristine, superjet blue uniform. They step into the cabin of a Boeing 747, turn left, and settle into plush red and blue seats. A flight attendant offers them a hot towel and a glass of champagne. The safety demonstration begins. The engines hum. This is the Pan Am experience. It is not a ride, it is a time machine, created by aviation historian Anthony Toth. This is a perfect 1-to-1 scale replica of a Pan Am 747 first-class cabin from 1971. Every detail is obsessive. The china plates are real Pan Am porcelain. The silverware is real. The seats are the actual seats salvaged from the desert boneyards. The magazines in the seat pockets are original copies of Time and Life from 50 years ago. People pay hundreds of dollars to spend 4 hours sitting here, eating a 5-course meal of Chateaubriand and caviar, served by actors playing the role of Pan Am stewardesses. They pay to pretend. Why? Why would anyone spend a Saturday night inside a fake airplane fuselage in an industrial park? Because the Pan Am experience offers something that modern aviation has completely exterminated: dignity. When you sit in those wide seats, with plenty of legroom, being treated like a guest of honor, rather than a security threat, you realize what we have lost. Pan Am didn't just sell transportation, it sold an event. Flying was an occasion. It was something you dressed up for. It was civilized. Today, flying is an ordeal. It is a bus ride in the sky. We are herded through security checkpoints, shouted at to remove our shoes, crammed into seats designed for children, and charged extra for a bag of pretzels. We are not passengers anymore. In the eyes of modern airline algorithms, we are self-loading freight. The success of the Pan Am experience proves that the ghost of the airline is still powerful. The brand has transcended bankruptcy to become to become a symbol of a lost optimism. It represents a retro future, a time when Americans believed that technology was going to make life more beautiful, not just faster and cheaper. But the legacy of Pan Am goes far beyond nostalgia and replica cabins. If you look closely, the DNA of Pan Am is still running the world. First, there's the concept of tourist class. Before Juan Trippe, flying was exclusively for the super rich. It was Trippe who fought the global cartels to lower ticket prices. He invented the rainbow class, economy. He believed that travel was a right, not a privilege. Every time you buy a cheap ticket to visit a friend in another country, you are using a system Juan Trippe fought to create. He democratized the sky. Second, the hotel industry. When Pan Am started flying to remote corners of the world in the 1940s, places like Belém, Brazil, or Karachi, Pakistan, there were no hotels that met American standards. So Trippe founded Intercontinental Hotels. He built luxury hotels in developing nations so his crew and passengers would have a safe place to sleep and clean water to drink. Today, Intercontinental is a massive global chain. But it started as a support system for an airline. Third, and most importantly, the technology. The Boeing 747, the jumbo jet that made mass tourism possible, would not exist without Pan Am. Trippe forced Boeing to build it. He pushed the engines to the limit. He bankrupted his own company to buy it. The 747 shrank the world. It allowed millions of people to cross oceans for the first time. It created the globalized economy we live in today. But there is a human legacy too, one that is both beautiful and tragic. We need to talk about the World Wings International. This is an organization of former Pan Am flight attendants. Decades after the airline vanished, they still meet. They still wear their wings. They raise money for charity. They support each other. I want you to think about that. How many ex-employees of a bankrupt company continue to meet 30 years later to celebrate the brand that fired them? Do you think former Enron employees have reunions? Do you think ex-Blockbuster clerks have a global society? No. But Pan Am was different. To work for Pan Am was to be part of a diplomatic corps. In the 1960s, Pan Am stewardesses were required to speak 2 languages, have a college degree, and pass rigorous etiquette training. They were the face of America abroad. When they walked through a terminal in Bangkok or Berlin, heads turned. They were celebrities. Even though the company betrayed them, stealing their pensions and leaving them with nothing, they remained fiercely loyal to the idea of Pan Am. They separate the management from the mission. The management was corrupt. The mission was noble. They truly believed that they were bringing the world closer together. This cult of Pan Am reveals a deep truth about corporate culture. You can buy a company's assets, but you cannot buy its soul. Delta bought the World Port, United bought the Pacific routes, but neither of them bought the loyalty. You can't buy the feeling of being a Pan Amer. However, we must end this analysis with a cold dose of reality. We, the consumers, are also responsible for the death of Pan Am. We killed it. How? By voting with our wallets. Throughout the 1980s, when Pan Am was struggling, travelers had a choice. They could pay $800 to fly Pan Am with excellent service, or they could pay $400 to fly a budget carrier like People Express with zero service. Overwhelmingly, the public chose the $400 ticket. We claimed we wanted luxury, but what we really wanted was cheap travel. We demanded lower prices, and the market responded. To lower prices, airlines had to cut food, cut legroom, cut staff, and cut dignity. The race to the bottom was driven by consumer demand. Juan Trippe's dream was to make flying affordable for everyone. He succeeded. But in doing so, he destroyed the business model that made Pan Am special. You cannot have 5-course meals and $99 tickets at the same time. The math doesn't work. So Pan Am is a martyr. It died so that we could have Ryanair, Spirit, and Southwest. It died so that flying could become as common as taking a bus. In the final part of this documentary, we are going to visit the grave of the man himself, Juan Trippe. We will look at the shattered remains of the fleet. Where did the great clippers go to die? And we will deliver the final verdict on the American century. Was the fall of Pan Am the canary in the coal mine for the decline of American influence? As the sun sets on the runway, the ghost of the Clipper is cleared for one last takeoff. In a quiet corner of Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York, there is a modest grave. The stone is simple. It reads, Juan Terry Trippe, 1899 to 1981. There is no statue of a Boeing 747, no eternal flame, just a small plot of grass surrounded by the noise of the city he helped build. Trippe died 10 years before his airline did. He was spared the sight of the auctioneers selling off his desk. He was spared the humiliation of seeing the blue globe on a freight train. But as we stand here, we have to ask ourselves the question that lingers over this entire story. Was Pan Am a failure? In business terms, absolutely. It went bankrupt. It wiped out shareholders. It left its employees destitute. It is a case study in corporate overreach and mismanagement. But if we judge it by its impact on the human race, Pan Am was one of the most successful organizations in history. Before Pan Am, the world was fragmented. Oceans were barriers. Cultures were isolated. Juan Trippe looked at a globe and didn't see borders. He saw connections. He forced technology to catch up with his imagination. He built the airports in the middle of the jungle. He built the hotels in the desert. He built the planes that could conquer the Pacific. He made the world small. Today, we take that small world for granted. We complain about legroom. We complain about Wi-Fi speeds. We complain about the food. But we forget the miracle. We forget that for $500, we can step into a metal tube in New York and step out in London 6 hours later. That miracle exists because Pan Am paved the way. Pan Am was the Icarus of the American century. It flew too close to the sun. It wanted to be everything. An airline, a hotel chain, a nuclear missile carrier, a space agency. Yes, they even had a reservation list for flights to the moon. It burned up in the atmosphere of its own ambition, but oh, what a flight it was. As we close the book on Pan Am, we are left with a final lesson. Empires, whether they are made of steel like Bethlehem or made of roots like Pan Am, are fragile. They are built by visionaries, sustained by workers, and destroyed by complacency. The airline is gone. The terminals are demolished. The brand is a logo on a t-shirt. But every time you look up and see a contrail cutting across the sky, remember the clippers. Remember the stewards in their white jackets and the pilots in their naval uniforms. Remember the audacity of a company that believed it could own the sky. Pan Am didn't just fly, it soared. And for a brief, shining moment in the 20th century, it took all of us with it. Thank you for flying with us on this journey through history. This has been Empire Dust. We are dedicated to uncovering the stories of the giants who built our world and then lost it. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Pan Am, please honor the legacy by hitting the subscribe button. It helps us keep these stories alive. Leave a comment below. Did you ever fly Pan Am? Do you miss the golden age of travel? Or are you happy with cheap tickets? Let us know. We'll see you in the next video where we will explore another fallen titan. Until then, keep your eyes on the horizon.